The Oppau disaster did not begin with a broken rule. That is what makes it harder. The rule stayed. The material changed. By the morning of September 21st, 1921, BASF had used explosives on hardened fertilizer roughly 20,000 times. Workers drilled into the cake salt, placed small cartridges, and broke it loose for transport. The record said the practice was safe. Then at 7:32 in the morning, the same routine turned a fertilizer silo into a crater. Afterward, BASF's own historical account would note that the site fire department had one ambulance for a blast that damaged thousands of buildings. The question is not simply why anyone would put explosives near fertilizer. The question is what happens when yesterday's proof of safety stays in command after yesterday's material no longer exists. Oppau was not a battlefield. It was a factory town on the Rhine, just north of Ludwigshafen, built around one of the most important chemical plants in Germany. The plant made nitrogen fertilizer from synthetic ammonia. That mattered after the First World War, when food, industry, and national recovery all depended on chemical production moving at scale. Inside the Oppau works stood silo Op 110. It held ammonium sulfate nitrate, a compound fertilizer made from ammonium nitrate and ammonium sulfate. Sources describe the Oppau material as a mixed salt, usually treated as a 50-50 mixture by weight. One half was useful and potentially dangerous. The other half was supposed to make the whole mixture safe enough for storage and handling. That belief was not casual. It had been tested. The mixture had been analyzed. The factory had experience. Before the disaster, the hardened product had been loosened again and again with small charges of explosive. The number repeated in modern technical sources is about 20,000 successful blasting operations without a notable incident. For any factory, that number can become more persuasive than a warning label. 20,000 is not proof. It is habit with a long memory. The fertilizer had a problem. During storage, it caked. It hardened into a mass that could not be shipped easily. Workers could not simply dig it out like loose grain. The plant's solution was to drill holes into the hardened salt and use small charges to break it apart. The procedure sounds reckless now, but in Oppau, it had become a controlled operation. The explosive charges were small. The mixture was believed to be below the dangerous ammonium nitrate threshold. The plant had run tests. The chemistry appeared to say the same thing as experience. But in late 1920 and early 1921, the material itself changed. Not its label, not its intended composition, its physical form. Originally, the hot fertilizer solution had been cooled and crystallized through a screw process. Then BASF introduced a spray drying process. The liquid was atomized under pressure and sprayed into the silo. The dried salt fell like a fine powder or snow. This made a drier product. It also changed particle size, density, moisture content, and the way the components were distributed inside the material. Those are quiet changes. They do not look like a new hazard from the outside. The silo still held ammonium sulfate nitrate. The paperwork could still show a 50-50 ratio. The average samples could still look acceptable. But later investigations and modern reassessments point toward a more dangerous reality. The spray process may have produced fine fractions with higher ammonium nitrate content, especially near the edges of the silo. It may also have made even normally mixed material more sensitive to detonation impact because of lower density, smaller particle size, lower water content, and inhomogeneous crystal structure. This is the central contradiction of Oppau. The procedure had not changed enough to alarm the people using it. The material had changed enough to make the procedure dangerous. On the morning of September 21st, workers prepared another loosening blast in silo Op 110. The exact placement of every charge cannot be reconstructed with certainty because the explosion destroyed the evidence. But the later technical chain is clear enough to examine. If a charge struck one of the fine nitrate-rich pockets, that pocket could detonate. If it detonated strongly enough, it could act like a booster for more ammonium sulfate nitrate around it. And if the surrounding material had been made more sensitive by the new drying process, the blast did not need the whole silo to be defective. It needed only enough vulnerable material in the right place. At 7:32, Oppau crossed that line. People in and around the plant heard two blasts close together. A fireball rose. Darkness followed. The shock wave moved through Ludwigshafen and Mannheim, then outward through towns along the Rhine. Windows broke in Heidelberg, Worms, Darmstadt, and reports say even Frankfurt, more than 80 kilometers away. Seismological instruments in Munich, roughly 300 kilometers from Oppau, registered the shock. At the center, silo Op 1 and 10 was gone. In its place was a crater. BASF gives its dimensions as about 96 meters wide, 165 meters long, and 18.5 meters deep. Later technical work estimates that only a fraction of the roughly 4,500 metric tons in storage actually detonated, perhaps hundreds of tons rather than the entire stock. That limit is important. It means the disaster was not the simple explosion of everything present. It was a partial detonation, powerful enough to destroy the silo, tear into the plant, and wreck the town beside it. The casualty numbers vary by source. BASF uses over 500 fatalities and around 2,000 injured. The FFI reassessment says more than 500 killed and nearly 2,000 wounded. A Chemical Engineering Transactions article gives 507 killed and 917 injured, while noting that the figures differ depending on source. Local German accounts often give 561 dead and about 2,000 injured. For narration, the safest statement is this: more than 500 people were killed and nearly 2,000 were injured. The numbers are not a decorative scale marker. They are a sign of where the risk had been placed. The factory and the town were not separate worlds. Oppau had grown with the plant. Workers lived near the production that employed them. When the silo exploded, the blast did not stop at the works fence. Around 2,000 buildings were damaged, and BASF says 1,036 were completely destroyed. In Oppau itself, local accounts describe the town as devastated. Roofs were lifted, walls cracked, doors and windows were driven from their frames in nearby communities. The first rescue work began with the workforce itself. The same industrial community that had accepted the routine had to respond to its collapse. The workers of Oppau and Edegheim, most living in streets within range of the explosion, helped pull people from the rubble before any outside organization had arrived. Volunteers, doctors, paramedics, fire departments, police, Red Cross branches, and French occupation forces came into the area. Classrooms became temporary hospitals. Other rooms became shelter for people who no longer had homes. BASF's medical department joined the work, and its head, Dr. Ernst Westhoven, helped organize care and transport the injured to the Ludwigshafen site. The single ambulance detail matters because it makes the scale visible. This was not a plant prepared for a town-sized catastrophe. This is where the story turns from accident into system. Not because everyone knew the precise danger. The record does not support that. The official inquiries after the disaster did not find a simple, proven cause that plant management had ignored in plain sight. They found something more uncomfortable, a procedure that had been justified by prior tests and prior success, then carried forward after the manufacturing process changed the material under it. The official record is most useful where it refuses to solve the cause. The Reichstag Committee, quoted in BASF's historical account, said the causes could not be reliably determined despite the investigation and expert help. That is not satisfying television. It is not a clean villain, but it is important evidence. The record could not prove the exact interaction of every factor. Modern reassessments still use cautious language. Likely, realistic possibility can be assumed, not possible to prove definitively. That uncertainty should not weaken the episode. It should sharpen it. The mystery at Oppau is not whether a small charge was involved, it was. The mystery is why the charge, in that material, on that morning, could do what 20,000 previous charges had not done. The answer is not one switch, it is a chain. First, the plant stored a fertilizer that could harden into a mass. Therefore, it needed a way to loosen it. Second, tests in past practice made small explosive charges appear safe. Therefore, blasting became routine rather than exceptional. Third, the drying process changed at the end of 1920 and was used exclusively by early 1921. Therefore, the fertilizer in the silo no longer behaved exactly like the material that had made the old routine feel safe. Fourth, average chemical analyses could still show acceptable composition. Therefore, local dangerous pockets and physical sensitivity could hide inside a material that looked safe on paper. Fifth, a loosening blast was carried out. Therefore, a local detonation could become a larger one. That chain is the disaster. The crater is only where the chain became visible. The post-disaster investigations focused on composition, testing, and process change. Early public explanations were cautious and sometimes defensive. BASF leaders insisted that the high-pressure ammonia process itself had nothing to do with the explosion. That distinction was technically important because Oppau was a symbol of modern chemical production. Synthetic ammonia meant fertilizer, food, and industrial power. A disaster there threatened not only a factory's reputation, but confidence in a national technology. That pressure shaped the way the event was understood. The company could say the mixture had been tested. It could point to thousands of successful operations. It could say the exact cause was not reliably determined. All of that could be true, but none of it answered the question that matters now. What happens when an old safety case survives a new process? The later technical reassessments read less like a solved mystery than a warning about habit. The routine was not proof of safety after the material change. Horscher's 2016 review is especially useful because it separates what people believed before the accident from what later tests suggested. Before Oppau, the main safety assumption focused on the ratio of ammonium nitrate to ammonium sulfate. If the mixture stayed around 50-50, the material was treated as non-explosive under the conditions tested. After Oppau, the picture widened. Particle size mattered. Density mattered. Water content mattered. Crystal structure mattered. Confinement and the strength of the initiating charge mattered. The danger had not been only chemical, it had been physical. And because the physical change was a production change, the warning did not arrive as a dramatic signal. It arrived as better drying, finer product, lower moisture, and a process that appeared to improve quality. This is not a story about people ignoring science. It is worse. It is a story about people trusting yesterday's science after yesterday's object no longer existed. The official story gap is not a cover-up claim. There is no need to sell one. A disaster can be unresolved in its exact trigger and still be clear in its conditions. Around the site, rebuilding began quickly. Aid flowed in. The Bavarian government helped organize Hilfswerk Oppau, a relief agency. BASF says that by 1924, more than 2,000 structures in Oppau and Edingheim had been rebuilt or newly built. More than 10,000 construction workers participated in rebuilding the plant premises. Ammonia production resumed after only 11 weeks. That speed is another part of the story. Industrial recovery did not wait for perfect understanding. It rarely does. A factory town needed work. A company needed production. A country needed fertilizer. The ruins were cleared, the plant resumed, and memory became a mixture of mourning, technical literature, corporate history, and local commemoration. But the practice did change. Modern technical sources note that using explosives to loosen solidified ammonium sulfate nitrate was forbidden after the Oppau disaster. Today, anti-caking additives in process safety management make the old method unnecessary. In process safety language, Oppau is often read as a management of change failure. Before a process change is implemented, its effect on safety characteristics must be checked, not only its effect on output quality. That phrase, management of change, can sound bureaucratic. At Oppau, it means something very specific. If the plant changes the way a fertilizer dries, it may also change the way that fertilizer responds to impact. If the samples are averages, they may miss dangerous local fractions. If a procedure has worked 20,000 times, it may become hardest to question precisely when it most needs to be questioned. The recurring image of this episode is a simple counter. 1 safe blast, then 10, then 1,000, then 20,000. Each number looks like evidence until the material underneath the number changes. The counter did not measure safety anymore. It measured confidence, and confidence was not the same thing. There is a temptation to tell Oppau as a story of obvious madness. Workers used explosives on fertilizer, and the fertilizer exploded. That version is true enough to be clickable and too thin to be useful. That is how a disaster becomes inevitable without looking inevitable. Not all at once. Not through one reckless morning, through a series of reasonable statements that were no longer complete. The mixture is still 50-50. The tests were successful. The previous blast did not fail. The product is drier. The average sample is acceptable. The procedure is routine. Each sentence leaves something out. Together, they make a silo vulnerable. On September 21st, 1921, Oppau did not discover that fertilizer could explode. Ammonium nitrate hazards were already known in broad terms. What Oppau exposed was narrower and more dangerous. A material can move from safe enough to sensitive enough without changing its name. The label stayed stable. The risk did not. That is why the cause remains partly uncertain, and the responsibility chain still matters. The exact spark does not need to be pretended into certainty. The storage practice, the caking problem, the explosive loosening method, the spray drying change, the hidden fine fraction, the average samples, and the unchanged routine have to be seen as one mechanism. The disaster did not begin at 7:32 in the morning. It began when a production change altered the fertilizer, but the old proof of safety stayed in command. The record cannot give us every grain of salt inside silo op 1 and 10. It cannot replay the exact charge placement or prove the precise fraction that detonated first. What it can show is more useful than a single spark. It shows how industrial confidence hardens. It shows how a number like 20,000 can stop being a question and become an answer. And in Oppau, that answer was standing inside the silo when the next question was fired into it.